Welcome to RotoGrinders Today. I'm Jordan Cooper, a.k.a. BlenderHD, BlenderHD. You're going to follow me on Twitter. It's Monday, May 6th, and you know what we do on Mondays on the show. It's Mondays with Mccool. We bring in James Mccool, the co-author with me on the Theory of Daily Fantasy Sports, the 15-hour audio DFS masterclass you can pick up at theoryofdfs.com. Also, the advanced players, of course, with James's Excel tools that I do use when making my DFS lineups, like my MMA lineups, my duplication checking, right? Mm-hmm. Not necessarily that I would need to have all unique lineups, but at least not build, the lineup that won this past MMA slate was duped a significant amount of times. Of course, didn't play it because probably negative EV in the long run, but it does help me out, this advanced players guide and the Excel tools. Go pick that up. Theoryofdfs.com. Hit that thumbs up button on your way in the door. Give me those thummy thumbs. Like those in the morning. Hit the subscribe button if you're new here. Hit the notification bell to know when we go live. Remember, Grinders Live, crunch time later today for the MLB slate. But James, over the weekend, I'm someone that I don't keep up with stuff, okay? This is not a new thing. I'm 45 years old. It was your birthday recently.
Was.
How are you? How old are you now? Are you 30 yet?
I'm 32. Yeah, I just passed it.
Okay. I was under the impression maybe you were 29. It's like maybe it was your 30th birthday.
Pretty close.
I'm 45. You're 32. I don't know who you follow on Twitter or whatever, but over the weekend, I've no idea what people are talking. I kind of get a sense what people maybe are talking about. They're referring to stuff. I don't know what it is. All I know is that all I know about Drake, is that he's the rapper, I guess, that he's the guy that puts $300,000 on probably the wrong side of a fight. Like that's all I know Drake for. And Kendrick Lamar, I don't have no idea. I've heard the name before. I don't know who these people are, but apparently people got their kicks off of. I guess the kids call them diss tracks. Is that what was happening? I back in the day, James. I don't want to be like I'm old, right? Daniel Hutchins, Dirty Tenors, like I'm old. I have no idea what the hell's going on. Yeah. Back in the day, I used to listen to rap. Okay. Back in the day, old school, like middle school, right? I'm from New York, center of hip hop. In order for to produce like the technology these days, I guess it used to be that Eazy-E, right, left NWA, right, and then he'd come out with an album with a whole bunch of like insults towards Dr. Dre, and then like 8 months later, it's like, oh, Snoop Dogg's album comes out and has 2 tracks that make fun of Eazy-E. It's like it just like it's almost like it's like slow. It's like this slow, we could keep track of this stuff, and now it's just apparently you just do it on like 2 hours notice. I guess. I mean, like what? Like that's what it seemed like. I don't know. Were you paying attention to any of this? Because it felt like Saturday night. I'm watching MMA.
Yeah.
And like 90% of my timeline is people mentioning diss tracks from 2 rappers.
Yeah. So, back in the day, like you didn't have the technology to have a beef escalate as quickly as this one did, right? Like this one back in the day, Eazy-E and Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre, they had to get through the process of putting out their music in order to then insult each other, right? Like we didn't have Twitter, we didn't have Facebook, we didn't have social networking. So it was either they had to go find each other out on the streets, or they had to write music about each other and then wait until they release an album to then get that out. That's not the game anymore, right? Like now, the instant that one of these dudes talk shit about one another, They know. Everyone knows instantly. So then it gets going, right? But you still have to go the process of writing the diss tracks. However, this is where the wrinkle comes in. All right. So Drake put out, I don't think Drake started it. It might have been Drake that started it, but I know that J. Cole was involved, and then Kendrick Lamar got involved later.
Okay, so
but
Drake, you know a lot more than I do. Okay, so
so
you can
I keep
be
up.
apprised. It seems like you're a little bit more up to speed. I barely know who these people are.
Yeah, well, I mean, I listen to music that wasn't made 50 years ago like you do. So Drake basically went after the wrong person here and ended up just pissing off Kendrick Lamar, who normally this would mean that like it takes a little bit of time for Kendrick Lamar to answer back. But Kendrick Lamar has hated Drake since like 2010. So he's been writing this stuff for like a decade, just waiting for his opportunity for Drake to slip up and put his name out there. And then he just unleashed as many nukes as he possibly could. And just, it was bad, man. It was basically like the most lopsided fight because Drake is like a lot of it just comes down to Drake being like a fake rapper. Everybody kind of knows he's a fake rapper, but like he's got the persona and he's got like all the stardom and everything like that. But he's not a real rapper. Like he's not a real dude. Kendrick Lamar is a real dude. And he grew up with like the background that you would expect a real rapper to have. Drake did not.
You mean from the white suburbs then? Yes.
Yeah. That's where Aubrey Graham grew up, aka Drake. So like Drake is fighting out of his weight class here, and it was just bad. So I mean Drake's track musically, sure, because he had better ghostwriters, but Kendrick Lamar actually just destroyed Drake's life. I mean, you don't come back.
So are these tracks even written by them? Is this like, can you just go on Chat GPT and just write? Can you just do that?
I mean, Drake for sure has ghostwriters. Kendrick, I am pretty sure, like Kendrick has some writers, I'm sure, but most of his stuff that he released about Drake was written from his heart and soul. So it was pretty bad. Kendrick for sure won the entire thing. It was basically like Drake released one thing talking shit about Kendrick Lamar, and then Kendrick Lamar brought down like one track and then another and then another and then another, and Drake is just sitting here yelling at his ghostwriters to speed up while Kendrick Lamar is just unleashing everything he's written for the last 12 years. It was pretty bad. So there you go. Kendrick, it was basically like, how should I state this? It was like if DJ Khaled was trying to come after like Tupac or something. It was entirely just broken. It was not a real fight. It was just Drake getting beat up, basically.
I just went on Chat GPT.
Okay.
And I asked, write a diss track about a daily fantasy sports player.
Oh man,
which one did it write about? It's writing it's chorus. Okay, so here's Chat GPT. Okay, there we go. Okay. Yo, listen up, gather round, let me spin a tale about a fantasy player whose ego was set to sail. He's all about the stats, thinks he's got the game down, but when the going gets tough, he's nowhere to be found. Started with the lineup, he thought he ruled the scene, but his picks were so weak, couldn't even make a dream. He's like a one-trick pony, always chasing the trends, but when it comes to strategy, he's got no dividends.
Oh, man.
Here's the chorus. Hey, no, this is a long song. Hey, Mr. Fantasy, what's with the empty boast? You talk a big game, but your lineup's just a ghost. You're a pretender in a game of kings. Better step aside because we're taking the rings. He talks a big talk like he's got it all planned, but his lineup's a disaster. Couldn't even take a stand. Spending all his cash on the flashy big names, but when it comes to winning, he's just playing games. He's like a deer in the headlights when the pressure's on. Can't handle the heat, man. He's already gone. Claiming he's a pro, but he's just a joke. In the world of fantasy, he's a sinking boat. And here's the bridge. You can crunch those numbers, but you'll never see. Fantasy's not just about the fantasy. It's about heart. It's about skill. And you, my friend, just don't fit the bill. So take a seat, watch us rise to the top. While you're stuck in the mud, your fantasy will flop. We're the true players, champions in our own right. So bow down, Mr. Fantasy, and say goodnight.
God, that's good. That rules. We got to put that against a track. I got people who produce music.
Here,
Like,
I just put it on the screen.
Dude, you got to send that to me. You got to send that to me.
I guarantee you, if you probably just type it in again, you probably get the same thing.
Okay, all right. So we have 3 DFS, right? We now need to produce an album, a rap album about daily fantasy sports.
I'm gonna write a diss. I'm gonna have it. Let's see, write a diss track about Alex Baker, or like it has to be enough that obviously that ChatGPT would know.
Say write a diss track about Alex Baker, aka Osimo, from.
I mean, I think I could just put that in. Let's see. Write a diss track about Alex Baker Osimo. Let's see. Yo, listen up. Let me paint you a scene. But a dude named Alex thinks he's living the dream. Calls himself Osimo like he's some kind of king. But let me tell you, folks, he's just a one-trick fling. Started with some spreadsheets, thought he'd rule the land. But when it comes to real skills, he's playing in quicksand. With his projections and algorithms, thinks he's got the might. But when it's time to perform, he's out of sight. Hey, Osimo, what's that empty crown? You talk a big game, but you're just a circus clown. In the world of fantasy, you're just a joke. Better step aside because we're about to provoke. He's all about the numbers. Thinks he's got the knack. But when it comes to strategy, he's just a hack. Spending all the time crunching stats in his lair. But when it comes to winning, he's just not there. With his fantasy projections and his DFS show, he's like a puppet dancing in a never-ending flow. But when competition gets fierce and tough, Osimo's left behind the dust and in the rough. Hey, Osimo, what's with the empty? Okay, that's the chorus.
The chorus, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar to the previous one. Yeah. Right. See, this is what Drake and Kendrick did, probably.
This is definitely what Drake did. This is for sure what Drake did.
So pack up your spreadsheets and bid us a good night. Okay, so it has some sense. ChatGPT has some it throws in enough references.
That was good. That was great.
We just need a beat now, right? We need someone to. I mean, this is not all that great rapping either. I mean, this is very, very linear wording and everything.
We need a 6-track album about daily fantasy sports. It doesn't have to be all rap. We can do one rap. We can do an R&B song. We can do we can do a heavy metal song. You know, we can do this.
Can I write a heavy metal song about write a death metal song?
Imagine this is the first time that you tune into this show with us.
Right, write a death metal song about daily fantasy sports. I want to see. I literally, when I typed it in earlier before about write a diss track about a daily fan, I didn't think it would actually work. I thought it would be like way too generic that it could be used for like anything. It's like, oh no, okay, it actually did it. So let's see if can we write a death metal song about. Okay, here we go. Oh, there we go. In the realm of numbers where warriors dare, daily fantasy sports a battlefield where we glare. Lineups forged and fired, strategy or might. We enter the fray ready for the fight. Daily fantasy sports, a game of blood and gore. We crush our foes, leaving them begging for more. With stats as our weapons, we'll conquer the night. In the arena of madness, we'll claim our rightful right. Drafting our armies with skill and with care, each player chosen a demon to bear. We face the odds with courage and might. In the dark abyss where champions ignite.
Guitar solo.
The highs and lows will never relent for victory. But yeah, this is more of a power metal song, right? Right. This is more power. This is not less death metal, a little bit more power metal.
This is incredible.
Right. Raising your banners high. Anything with involving knights and stuff like that, and victory and glory. Typically power metal.
Fun fact: you can go there. There are AI systems out there that will actually create music for you based on prompt, not just like words. We could go do this with one of those.
The most impressive part of this is that it knew exactly with the style of music that there's just a guitar solo. It says guitar solo in there, just with
It
that.
goes right
This is
after the
obviously
bridge.
a power metal song. Because
Yeah.
this part, this guitar, we take a look at, like, oh, there's not many verses. You'll take a, if this is a power metal song, you look at this like, oh, it's like, oh, this song must be like, this is a short song. It's like, no, this is a 7.5 minute song.
Yeah.
Like that's it. But there's only this many words. It's, yeah, we get the bridge is probably 2.5 minutes, of the guitar solo is 1.5 minutes by itself. So like, yeah, like that's welcome to power metal.
That's so good. This has been fun. This has been a fun little foray.
Well, that's why I asked you. I didn't know you knew about the Drake and Lamar stuff and Drake and Kendrick stuff, and I thought it would be fun. And then it went to, can we actually make a diss track about other DFS players?
This was fun. I thought this was fun.
Right. This is what we do on Mondays, right? Not talk about things that actually matter, right?
No, it doesn't matter. Come on.
Right. Can I make contest sims through ChatGPT?
I think
I'm assuming, James, I'm assuming that you do get with programming, you do get some help with this, because I mean I use it.
I don't use ChatGPT. I use Google's Gemini. But
Okay, but I mean the same type of getting like optimizing code, or getting, I need a function in, like, for Excel, I'll go, I need a function in that does this, and it just gives it to me. I'm like, okay, that's better than just like figuring it out myself.
Yeah, it's incredibly helpful. There were a couple things that I couldn't figure out. I mean, I was running into with my most recent set of seed frame logic for the contest sims. I was running into this issue where it was like, I'm going to get kind of tech speaky here, but I was trying to take a NumPy array and I was trying to replace things with using a dictionary of team names. And I was running into this issue where, like, inconsistently, it would cut the acronyms of the team names down to just 2 letters rather than 3. So, like, it would, instead of giving it the name HOU for Houston, it would just go HO, or it would go like, instead of New York Yankees, it would just do NY. And that was confusing if the Yankees and Mets were playing on the same slate, because then, like, which New York team is it? So then, yeah, I had to do a little bit of debugging using Gemini and came across the fact that with the algorithm that I'm using, it will take the path of least resistance. And if there are any strings that are shorter, it will try to match with that amount of characters in the string. So if San Diego was playing on the same slate as New York Yankees, the acronym that I use for San Diego is SD. So it was only 2 characters. So it was inconsistently saying, oh, well, if I can only use 2 characters when matching with SD, I can use it when matching with the New York Yankees, and then it would only do NY. So yeah,
Why don't you just make them all 3? Why don't you just make them all 3 letters?
I did end up doing
it. I mean,
that
that's typically the reason why you see most of them 3 letters. So you don't have to worry about anything. NYY, NYM, SDP, like stuff like that.
Yeah, I had never done that. And one of the reasons why I hadn't done that is because I had used Fangraphs as the basis for my baselines, and Fangraphs does SD instead of SDP.
Right.
So I just had that in my baselines and in the back end, and I had never had a reason to change it until now. And I still just use SD for a handful of things. I still use those shorter acronyms for a handful of things, but for the contest and stuff specifically, now it is SDP and KCR and TBR, like going through to 3 just to solve that issue, because otherwise it was very annoying.
But you've been working on building your own contest sims over at PayDirt. Obviously, we have our own here at RotoGrinders with Sim Labs.
Yeah,
obviously I could show on the screen. Now, obviously, you don't have one as nice, the interface and everything here, but I mean, you don't necessarily need the nicest of interfaces for spit out lineups that are plus EV and choosing between them and stuff like that. What are some of the things that you're doing in a simulation standpoint that may differ from the rest of the industry? And how do you, like, to me, the biggest thing about sims, and I've said it since the beginning, is that if you're not simulating against a representative at least a reasonable enough representative set of opponent lineups. It's like the results are kind of gobbledygook, but you get a paradox problem. So large fields, like let's say the difference between a 50,000 entry field and a 100 entry field, right? There's a little bit more extremes, right? 50,000 entries, it's going to be very hard to predict outlier lineups. There's going to be 100, 200, 300, maybe 500 lineups that God knows what. Someone banged their head against the keyboard, and how are you ever going to, someone built everything one-offs, and like, good luck predicting which one's those going to be. But that the amount of lineups compared to the total field of lineups is small enough that while you may not be completely accurate on the field, like every, as many of the lineups that are going to be in the field, the EV of each lineup that you compare it against is probably much has less margin of error. Meaning that because you're building 50,000 lineups, you're probably, every stack is being represented pretty much, right? And every pitching combination is probably being represented enough where, well, if the Pirates go off, it's like you probably have the winning lineup, and like you could predict that there's maybe the amount of Pirate stacks, maybe in your simulation you have 28 of those, and it turns out there's only 20.
Yeah.
But since most of the equity in these contests are at the top, that if you didn't play a Pirate stack, you're probably not in the top 10, and the price structure goes down enough that like all the EV of your lineup is in those not top 10 spots anyway, that the difference between 21 and 28 lineups is probably not as directionally, the numbers are going to be pretty accurate. But in the small field with 100, like it's much easier to project and construct lineups that make sense for that contest. But the difference between one Pirate stack and two Pirate stacks in that example will dramatically change the EV of all the lineups. And it's quite possible that there may be zero, which means the Pirates put up 17 runs and you don't even need them because no one has the stack. Like someone has a 1 or 2 off. Like to predict the exact 100 lineups is so much more difficult, even though each individual lineup will look much more sensible. You're probably not going to bang your head against the keyboard lineups. You could probably look at ownership, look at projections around the industry and go, okay, I think these pretty much are what kind of the lineups are going to look like. But if you're off just a little bit, like the difference between like a plus 28% ROI lineup and a minus 56% ROI lineup could mean the difference of one extra person deciding to play, this pitching combination or this stack or this one-off being, instead of being 8% owned, being 18% owned. And it's like, that's an extra like 10 lineups that you didn't project. And then next thing you know, all your numbers are kind of off. So I don't know if you want to go into, what you put into that, but to me, what I've described is like probably the hardest problem to solve in this, because I think sims are much more worthwhile, much more valuable for smaller field contests. But to get numbers that EV and ROI numbers and contest sims that accurately reflect that it becomes actionable is very difficult.
Yeah. So take like a half step back. And I think that what you're describing is, in theory, what we want to achieve, but will never be achievable in practice. Right? So as contest sims and as this logic gets better, more people will use it and rely on it to make lineup sets. And in doing so, you are getting farther away from what the projected ownership will be and what it actually becomes, right? So if you project, say, let's give an extreme example for today. If you project Cole Ragans, and I'm looking at my results right now. If you project Cole Ragans at 30%, right? 30% ownership today. And the contest sims say, oh, well, he should be in 60% of lineups. He should be twice as highly owned, right? Right now, there are enough people that are not using contest sims and are not viewing him as significantly undervalued that moves the needle maybe 5 to 10%, right? So then he ends up 40% owned when we thought he should have been 30% owned, and he deserved to be 60% owned, but we still have that delta of like 20% owned between 60 and 40. Eventually, as this continues to become more widespread, and as we continue to improve the technology across the industry, that delta is going to start shrinking. If he projects for 30% owned and contest sims across the industry say that he should be 60% owned, right now we have a 20% delta because it moves at 5 to 10%, but maybe in a year it moves it 10 to 15%. And now that delta gets smaller. And then maybe a little bit later, maybe things improve so much and then become so widespread that he's projected at 30%. The sims say that he should be 60%. And now that moves him, up to that 60%, right? And then we start getting into that point where, oh, he's no longer a good play. And then we move it back towards, let's say that we have an instance where a player is projected to be 10% owned and the sims say that he should be 20% owned. And then everybody says, oh, this guy's undervalued and he's a value play. And then all of a sudden he gets pushed up to like 35%, right? And then all of a sudden now he is a bad play, even though the Sims said that he was a good play, but he's a bad play because the Sims said that he was a good play, right? Eventually we get into that point where our prediction of what we think will happen then becomes or then produces a result that is over what we think is worthwhile. And then that causes really, really bad problems with technology like this because the answer that we gave then becomes the wrong answer, right? And in practice, that's really, really difficult. Yeah, if we get to that point, we're all dead. Exactly.
Right, but I mean, to me, I don't think that's the biggest. You make that out to be a big deal. I don't think it is because
no. It's not a big deal yet.
Enough people, I mean, like,
not a big deal yet. So,
but even if it was, for instance, let's say, because you know me, lineups not players,
right?
If you told me that ownership. I mean, this is a concept that is obviously in Theory of Daily Fantasy Sports, theoryofdfs.com. Feel free to pick up the courses. Let's say all the ownership is efficient on a player level, right? Let's just use an example, right? Let's say it's 100-person contest or whatever. Mm-hmm. All the ownership, if a guy's projected to be 32% owned, he's 32% owned.
Right.
If a guy's batter's projected to be 14% owned, he's 14% owned. Right. Mm-hmm. This guy's 2%. He's in 2 lineups. Right. Mm-hmm. It's quite possible that one lineup has insanely high ROI over the other 99 lineups.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. That others, because of the construction of the lineup to each other, like it's not just we take a look here that Walker Buehler today is going to be overowned. It's like
no,
Walker.
But you're missing the point. You're missing the point.
What?
The point is that if we continue to evolve this technology to the point where ownership then becomes pointless, then the lineups that have been produced by the contest sims are then in and of themselves also pointless because they would not be representative of the field.
No,
that's the point.
Well, they would be representative. I mean, in your
scenario,
they wouldn't.
Not if what we are projecting in terms of ownership and projection, because that's the 2 inputs, and this is why. A couple weeks ago, when I said that I thought the contest sims would be less valuable for MLB than they are for NBA, we have a much more precise projection in terms of ownership and projected outcomes. So contest sims are able to better represent the fields that we are going to be playing in, which then is what we calculate our ROI and our EV off of. So if we get to a point where people are using contest sims and making notable swings in the ownership of players, then the ownership we are using to produce the contest sim backends will no longer be representative of the field that we are projecting against. Therefore, the ROI.
I get that. No, I'm going.
Right.
I'm going past that.
Okay. So go past that.
I'm going past that. I'm just saying that that the individual ownership of players is different. I mean, I'm stepping back just to show a concept. We have so many people watching that it's the same reason previous to contest sims. When everyone's playing around with optimizers like lineup HQ, which I could still do, that people would put in their exposures, right? I want to have 35% of this guy. I want to have 20% of that guy. I want to have half the field. I want to double the field. Like all these types of in relation to the field types of things are all player based, not lineup based. That it's very easy for one person to put in. It's like I want here's 50 exposures of 50 different players, and they press the build lineup button. And then I have the same amount of exposure to all those players, and my lineups are 3 times more profitable than yours because, you're right. You're right. You have 30% of this guy, but 27% of that 30% is with this other thing that doesn't make any sense. Like just because you have that much. So that's why I view that there's a difference between is Cole Reagan's going to be, he looks to be overowned, so less people are going to play him, which means the field representative set of your lineups is not going to be accurate enough to reflect that people are also kind of looking at sims. Well, there are tons of people that do that and still make bad lineups.
Right. But my point is that those
you have to actually, what I would think, James, is to back test. I mean, I'm assuming you have you do some type of back testing where you're building a representative set of lineups and then comparing to the actual set and then judging that. And I mean, truthfully, you could probably train in the future on, I mean, to me, I don't know, maybe Daniel in chat could answer this. I wouldn't care about like an overall like R squared of like actual to like projected lineups. What I would care about is that how close are the full lineups? What percentage of lineups are within some type of margin of error of what was generated? And to me, that's very similar to like how you could tell how many people are like how many Sims users there are. Like very similar. The heuristic before is like how many 150 maxers are there? Right? It's like, this field has 36% of the field is 150. Like you have to kind of assume that the 150 maxers are probably profitable players or they'd be dead playing that many lineups for so long. And then go, okay, that's how I'm going to judge the skill of like the field.
Right.
And for this, maybe you could judge the skill based on simulated lineups versus actual and how many were way off to the theoretical equilibrium. That's kind of what I'm saying. It's like if you were to build a perfect equilibrium lineup field of 50,000 lineups, that it was as close to perfect equilibrium, you want to judge what the actual was off of that. And the more off it is, the more likely, obviously, you're playing with a bigger edge. And the less that it's off, like, because you really you don't care about, was this guy 36% on, but he should have only been 30, because if those lineups just aren't even close to the lineups, even if Cole Reagan's Walker Buehler lineups are supposed to look like X.
Right.
And there's those two pitchers are both owned in equilibrium, but the lineups they're being played in are lineups that don't come anywhere close to the equilibrium lineup, right, of what it should be. Then it doesn't matter what their individual player ownership is, because you care more about the 10 players together as a set than the individual. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, but I also think that like if you absolutely care about the lineups that are built, and to answer one of those questions, like in the contest sims app that I built, you can choose the skill of the field. So you can choose between how sharp is the field, very above average, average, below average, or not very. And that is based on how likely the lineups are to be used in the contest size that you are choosing to run. And that is based off predicted ownership and value and projection. So in the back end, it's creating lineups that are likely. It starts with just create a whole bunch of lineups, and then it squeezes things down a little bit incrementally to then start caring more and more and more about ownership and value, until eventually you get to this point where it's only creating lineups that are really high in ownership and value. And that's what's considered sharp lineups. We should assume that the best players are playing the best plays. So that's kind of, without getting too into the weeds, how the seed frames are created here. And then when you actually want to run the contest sims that I built, you choose how sharp the field is, and then it's going to choose from a subset of a threshold within the seed frames that have higher or lower representation of the lineups that we would expect to be played by better players. So that's how I assess the skill of the field that you are running. But even outside of that, like when you are looking at how the lineups are likely to be represented by the field in actuality, it's much easier in NBA because we can ignore correlation. It's much easier in PGA because we can ignore correlation. MLB is really an interesting thing to build in this way, because when you're rapid fire and shotgunning lineups, 5-man lineups do not show up very often. In terms of like optimality, they just don't show up very often. So you have to think about like what subset of lineups you're giving up in order to bring up representation of ownership and projection in a sport like baseball or hockey even, right? Like line combos are really, really hard to get right, even if you have the ownership correct, right? So to speak to your point, it's really interesting to try to do both of those things in a real field simulation, because like I don't know how it works on the RotoGrinders backend, but when I'm creating lineups and when I'm generating lineups using my algorithms, like so much of it comes down to I have to incentivize the lineups that are made to end up chasing correlation, because otherwise they just won't show up. And you can't just optimize 500,000 lineups, right? Like that would take forever, even with really strong algorithms, because the optimization algorithms that you have at your disposal are still relatively slow. So it brings up this really kind of sticky situation with MLB, and it's again another reason why I think that contest sims for MLB are not near as powerful as they are for NBA, where correlation kind of ends up being like, okay, I know that 30% of the field is 150 maxers. I know that 150 maxers are going to have somewhere between 20 to 25% of their lineups be highly correlated. So how do I force in 15% of 5-man stacks? And that's a really tough problem to solve. But all of that to be said, your point about the lineup being the thing that matters and it being representative of the field, the reason why I say that eventually we get to a point where in theory that makes a lot of sense, and in practice it just becomes like a pipe dream, is because people are so reticent. It's like you galaxy brain yourself into thinking that this is going to be something that people don't do, and then everybody talks about it, and then everybody's doing it, and now it's not as valuable anymore. And then we go from like everybody should be using contest sims, and then okay, everybody's using contest sims, and now we're overreacting to so many of the good plays. The good plays end up being too highly owned, and then the representation of the lineups that have those good plays are then over-owned because people are plugging them into optimizers or using the lineups from the contest sims.
Right, but
and then the things underneath those and then end up being more profitable. Like one instance of that was back in NFL season. Jonathan Taylor was projected to be 36% owned. Derrick Henry was projected to be 18% owned. And then because of contest sims, we flipped the frickin' cards, and Derrick Henry is 32% owned, and Jonathan Taylor is only 22% owned. And because they were the same price, the lineups that could have had either one then flipped, and then the representation is off, and then the lineups that have either one, the EV is then flipped on them. So that's while the individual ownership of players does not necessarily matter when you are creating lineups, for contest sims, the individual ownership of players can matter a lot because a lot of this is interchangeable. And like what one instance for today is like Cole Raggins and Tyler Anderson, right? Cole Raggins is $300 more than Tyler Anderson for whatever reason. I could not tell you why, but Cole Raggins is $8,800 and Tyler Anderson is $8,500. If Cole Raggins is projected at 40% owned and Tyler Anderson is projected at 10% owned, and let's just say that there's like a 4-point projection difference between the two. Cole Raggins projects 4 points better. If contest sims, we got to the same point like we did with NFL, and then all of a sudden now the lineups that should have had Cole Raggins, people then inserted Tyler Anderson because he was higher EV in the contest sims, then he ends up being 30%, Cole Raggins ends up being 20%, but in reality, Cole Raggins is still a better play than Tyler Anderson, and now Tyler Anderson is overowned. So it just begets this point where, because of the contest sims and because of what people see as the projected ownership and the EV on the players, because even in contests, even in sim labs, you can see that Luis Castillo is 18% owned lower or 18% higher in his exposures, in his optimality, than what his projected ownership is. And that's because on the back end, when you run those sims, he shows up in more lineups than he is projected to be in.
Right.
But if more people use him, then those lineups.
Well, they use his lineups. I mean, the key.
Right. If more people
use, stay away from the players and more about the lineup.
Sure. If more people use the lineups that he is in, then those lineups start to lose EV the more people that start using the lineups that he is in. So that's kind of what I mean by like, for contest sims to continue to be valuable, less people have to use them. It's not like the optimizer thing. Like, well, it's kind of like the optimizer thing, but because it is so fragile to the ownership projections that are used, that the more efficient the ownership then becomes, the less valuable the contest sims are at pointing out what lineups are plus EV.
Right, but the thing that, like what Daniel said in chat, I'm trying to get to the main problem. See, like Daniel said, like, so the easiest way to judge distance from equilibrium is look how many lineups are losing more than the rake in post-lock sims, because at equilibrium, all lineups lose exactly the rake. Yeah, but that's not actionable. What I'm talking about is judging how representative your pre-lock sims are to actually, like, I don't care. Post-lock, what can I do? I can't do anything afterwards of like, oh, which lineups were actually plus EV and which ones aren't. Well, it's based on what actually were in the lineup. Like, you need that information, right? What did people actually, if we could go in time with a time machine, it's the equivalent of, okay, I'm going to run my sims with 50,000 entries or whatever contest, 100,000, 10,000, whatever contest size. Like, if you had the actual at that point pre-lock, that would be that perfect, right? I mean, like, you couldn't get any more perfect than that, other than to obviously take out one, and one would be your lineup, and you'd run every lineup that you consider playing against the field of 999,000, whatever, minus one or something like that. I'm saying, how do you judge the creation of the lineup? So, for instance, I don't judge, like, heuristically in the past. You would say, okay, I'm going to play Andrew Heaney because I think he's going to be X% owned, and I think he should be Y% owned. I think he's under-owned, so I'm going to play him more, right? That's that very blunt way of leverage in game theory. Of Luis Castillo is going to be way under-owned, so I'm going to play him more often, which of course raises his ownership because of other people think that way, right? But that's on a player-by-player basis.
Right.
On a lineup basis, I want to be able to create 50,000 lineups right, that I'm going to simulate, and then look at the actuals, not run post-lock sims on the actuals. How do we compare both lineup sets and go, what is the R? I don't want to say it's the R squared, but how close was your field to the actual field?
Right.
Because that's something that you could that is actionable. That the
Right.
post lock sims aren't actionable. I can't do anything with them. So if I figure out that, hey, the sims say that this should be the field, right? Because your conundrum is that the more and more people use contest sims, right? The contest sims and the projected field are assuming inefficiencies that may end up not being there because everyone can see the inefficiencies, right? Like
Right.
that's kind of you go to our Slate IQ here at RotoGrinders, you go to our top stack tool, something like that, and it says, oh, the Royals are under-owned today. And then more people start making Royals lineups because they looked at it.
Right.
The next thing you know, you open up the card, will flip open, and the Royals are 2% overowned. And it's like, weren't they supposed to be underowned? Right? But that, to me, that's a field creation thing. So, like, if, for instance, if we just looked at it we shouldn't be looking on a player level, right? But let's use, for instance, the player level of Luis Castillo. If let's say I'm making these numbers up because I don't know. I'm just kind of looking at the slate. Let's say he's going to be 12% owned, but he should be 30, right? And I go, okay, I'm going to play more of him, right? If he comes in at 12% owned, you know what? The lower and lower Luis Castillo comes in owned, heuristically, very blunt, common sense way. If I look at my sims and it shows that Luis Castillo should be 30% owned, and I go to another site and they projected him she should be 30% owned. It's like, if any way that you ran this reasonably, he should be 30% owned and he comes in at 12% owned. One could assume that not as many people are looking at this stuff as the field, right? The field has not reacted to what the sims have obviously said, that Luis Castillo should be more owned, and he's not. But if Luis Castillo comes in at 26% owned, even though he's projected to be 12, you can assume that more people have looked at the sims, which is what exactly that you're saying. But I don't care about Luis Castillo. I care about the lineups that Luis Castillo are in. So, for instance,
no. You cannot separate the two in this, though. You can't separate the two because the ownership of Luis Castillo is directly related to the lineups that he is in.
Right,
in the concept James, of, I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying.
No, you're not. You don't know what I'm saying.
I do.
So instead of looking at Luis Castillo, look at, if you generated 12% Luis Castillo, right? Yes. And he came in at 26%. I don't care about the delta between Luis Castillo. What the 12% of Luis Castillo lineups, all 10 players, how many of those are represented in the 26%? Like, I want to know what the Luis Castillo. I don't care about the Luis Castillo lineups that look like nothing that I would have ever. Like, these are the lineups that you can kind of throw out. I want to know that. I want to know the gap between those two. And to me, if the closer the lineups in actual look like the sim lineups, then it shows more and more who's using. Because take a look at sim labs that we have here at RotoGrinders. We give you lineups. I mean, you could go here. I could produce 150 lineups from our sims, assuming, like, obviously closer to lock time, not 9:22 in the morning.
Right. Yeah.
But imagine, let's use this extreme example, James, that it's a 10,000, it's a 15,000 entry contest.
Yeah.
Okay. And every participant is entering 150 lineups. Right. So there's 1,000 users, 150 lineups, and all of those users are using sim labs and just saying, give me 150 based on whatever criteria that you want. So literally all of the lineups in the contest are from sim labs, right? If that's the case, shouldn't the actual and the simulated field look the same? Like, shouldn't it be close? Because you're getting all the lineups from the sims, right? So like anyone that was not using SimLab should have lineups that are less likely to be lineups that would have been used representatively. But the more and more people that use it, shouldn't the field look closer? Shouldn't Luis Castillo be more owned because more people are? Shouldn't Walker Buehler be less owned because you're comparing the actual versus the simulated field? And
Right.
shouldn't that you care more about that because that's what you'd be doing day in and day out rather than looking at post-lock sims with the actuals going, well, what lineup, like how many of these lineups were in your original? If it turns out that, well, only 8% of the lineups that I simulated against actually showed up, maybe not exact, but close, and if whatever threshold on how close matching these 10 players are to each other, you want a 2v2 or something or better. If you find that, oh, I only have 8% of the lineups that were anywhere close, like how valuable can your sims be if you like 92% of the lineups, you're not even like represented in your field. So shouldn't there be some way of back test? In general, I said, shouldn't there be some way of back testing? This is what I represented the field as. This is what the field actually came in as. How close was I? Like just in a very generality.
Yeah. So I get what you're saying. And I agree. And it's the hardest thing to do here is creating an actually representative field. If you remember, I think it was right when Skotastic was putting out their stuff, and I was super skeptical of it because they weren't actually doing any field creation. They were just basically simulating against their own optimals, right? So
or you had to upload your own. I mean, basically, you
just say,
here's the field, right?
And they were basically just like, here, you can simulate your lineups against each other, like, and that wasn't representative of the field, right? So now we have gotten to a point where I think that things like SimLabs do a better job of that, of simulating against the field. And the stuff that I build is trying to simulate against field. And it is very, very difficult to create precise replications of what the field is going to look like in any given contest. It's extremely hard. The example that you gave of like 8% of lineups being matched to a field, I think if you were to get 8%, you'd probably be like, that's low, but anywhere between like 15 to 20%, if you can have your field represented by 15 to 20% of the lineups that are actually used, that's probably not terrible.
Yeah, but for an exact that's why I made the claim of like within a realm of like, if it's a 5-man stack with 3 1-offs, I mean, you're probably like, if you get just like, oh, well, this $2,700 player versus that $2,800, I would consider that enough of a match. Like,
that's
whatever your threshold of that, it doesn't have to be exact, but if you're like, if you said, I want to compare all of the lineups that I generated versus the actual, and if there's any matches within a 3v3 of anything, right? As long as I got 7 out of 10 of what was representative, if you said that, oh, I got 86% match based on that criteria, I'd say your simulated fields are pretty strong.
So here's the way that I do it, and it's utilizing some of the stuff that we do in Theory DFS. The duplication checker logic is kind of a base of what I do for contest sim checking against actuals. So I'm using how many lineups are likely to be represented based on the aggregate ownership and based on the aggregate projection of the lineup. So what it does
also the salary,
right, and the salary, right. So what it does, for instance, one of the lineups that I'm looking at that was spit out by the contest sim logic that I use, I simulated a small average field. So this is like, I think 1,000 entries and average ownership and projection. One of the lineups is Cole Ragans, Luis Castillo, Gary Sanchez, Freeman, Lux, Muncy, Anderson, Outman, Starling Marte, and Andy Pages. It's a 5-man Dodgers stack with Starling Marte, right? And Luis Castillo and Cole Ragans. That lineup is very likely to be used. And the reason I know that it's very likely to be used is because the ownership projection on it is very high. The salary used was $49,800, and the projection was relatively high. So I can use those things as a proxy for understanding what lineups are likely to be used within the field that I'm projecting. The less sharp that I expect a field to be, the lower those constraints end up being. There's some lineups that get produced in the seed frame, and the seed frames that I produce that I load into this app, they're 500,000 lineups for DraftKings and FanDuel. So it's a huge pool that we're working with. Like there's some lineups in there that project for like 89 fantasy points and 16% projected ownership, right? Like, and those are going to be in like the bottom of the barrel. You're projecting a not sharp field at that point. Or you're projecting a very large field, right? And those two things typically go in hand. So that's what I use as a proxy for understanding what the field is likely to be doing and making sure that lineups are likely to be within that field. To answer the question of how representative of the field is my seed frame, I would say that the best thing that you can do is probably try to say, how many of my lineups contain at least 5 of the players that would be in these lineups, right? And compare those back and back and back and back. That's how you would probably back test this.
That's only half. That's only half of a lineup. I mean, I think that's a.
Well, let's say 5 hitters, not 5 pitchers,
or even 5 hitters. I mean, you talk about a stat. I mean, I think you have to go larger than that.
Like Hutchins said, it's extremely hard to try to say. If you're aiming to project, man, I don't even know what a high end would be. If you're aiming to project more than like on a large field, on one of the flagships, if you could get 25 to 30% of the lineups represented, I think you'd be in a really good spot for logic that is trying to project out these kind of things. Because the human nature of the lineups that are created in these larger fields, and if you're just trying to do like the 250, like a 500-man contest, at that point you might as well just optimize based on aggregate, right? Like you're not even really using contest sims for something like that, because if you're trying to just create that field, the field is so sharp that like you're just using the best players and the best lineups that are created, and that's kind of what I try to do in the contest sims too. Is I'm just using like the cream of the crop lineups to create that field. But as you get onto larger fields and worse player skill, trying to include lineups that have a projection of like 75 and a total ownership of like 28, it's like you can do it.
I don't care about those. Those lineups are.
But I'm answering your question of trying to say that you're creating a field. You're creating what you would expect to be the field, and you're trying to match it against what the field is. The actual lineups that are created in these flagships, like you might as well just randomize. So saying that you want to try to represent the field, the best thing that you can do is try to represent the field based on combinations of ownership and projection and salary, and try to stay within those thresholds of realistic lineups that would be created, rather than trying to create the lineups themselves. It's just really, really hard to do. And I think it's hard to do across the industry. And it's one of the things that make it so contest sims and players continue to have edge. Because if we could do that, if everybody was just using SimLabs lineups, then like contest sims wouldn't be useful, because you'd just be creating the same stuff. Like it just wouldn't be useful. Did you type something in a chat GPT? Is that why you're laughing at me? Okay, all right, cool.
I asked it to write a diss track about DFS contest simulations.
Okay, all right, let's hear it. Good one to end on.
So here's the chat GPT diss track.
All right.
Yo, gather round, let me lay down the truth about these DFS sims, man. They're just uncouth. They claim to predict like some crystal ball, but when it comes to reality, they're bound to fall. Simulating lineups like it's some kind of game, but when the real contest hits, they're not the same. They're like a broken record stuck on repeat, but when it's time to perform, they can't compete. DFS is the chorus. DFS simulations, what a load of trash. You talk a big game, but your predictions crash. In the world of fantasy, you're just a sham. Better step aside because we know who I am. They crunch the numbers like they're some kind of sage, but when it comes to accuracy, they're stuck in a cage. They think they're so clever with their fancy code, but when the games are played, they're left on the road. They're like a false prophet preaching from their throne, but when the chips are down, they're all alone. So take your simulations and throw them in the bin. In the world of fantasy, you just can't win. You just can't. This is the bridge. You can't predict the future with your fancy math. In the world of DFS, you've met your wrath. It takes more than algorithms to rule the game. So pack up your simulations and hang your head in shame. So here's the truth in black and white. DFS simulations, you're just not right. In the world of fantasy, it's skill that prevails. So take your simulations and set sail.
That was so good. That was just on the nose for everything we just said.
Oh. But
It's been a good one.
The fact that it knows what a diss track is pretty good.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
I didn't think it would work. I didn't think it would know what DFS contest simulations were, but apparently it has enough. It knows enough.
That is super ironic of ChatGPT dissing algorithms. That's really
right. Yeah, ChatGPT is like, what? James, so you're working on contest sims over at PayDirt?
Yeah.
I
I just finished putting together a lot of the logic. It's running now. It is open to the public for beta testing now. So you can reach out to me on Twitter at PayDirt_DFS, or you can just ask me in the Discord if you're over in the PayDirt Discord. I'm happy to give you a link. It did crash yesterday, so I know that I have to up the CPU a little bit on it. But yeah, just go ahead and use it and let me know how you like it.
Right, and if you don't like it, just write a diss track about it.
Right. Yeah. Go hit up ChatGPT for a diss track.
Obviously, you can do sim labs here at RotoGrinders if you're a premium member. So click on that link in the description. We're running a couple of sales for a 6-month membership. One, you get money off for 1 month. You could try it out for 3 days. We got all the information in the description. Hit that thumbs up button on your way out the door. You know how much I like the thummy thumbs. Hit the subscribe button if you're new here. Hit the notification bell to know when we go live. We got Grinders live in Crunch Time later today for MLB. I'll be back tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll have Tim on. We'll be taking a look. Talking mostly MLB, right? Friday, we'll talk a little MMA. Obviously, answering your questions. So feel free to always stop on by, ask whatever it is that you want about daily fantasy, props, and pick 'em. That's what I talk about here. Monday through Friday, 11 o'clock Eastern on RotoGrinders Today.